So I'm Marc from Parsec. I'm the CEO, one of the founders, and we are the first marketplace for advertising that's focused on consumer attention. So every time we show somebody an ad, we can actually measure how much attention they pay to it, which gives us the unique opportunity to optimize towards more attention. So that's it for the product pitch. Let's talk about blockchain. So we see blockchain as having three different phases. The first phase is digital money, which is Bitcoin, right? The second phase is programmable money, which is Ethereum. So I think everybody here is familiar with those two concepts, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So the third thing I think people aren't so familiar with, which is the most exciting application of blockchain to me, is the tokenization of assets. So the first two phases are largely focused on monetary transactions, right? Which is like, I can send money to somebody, or I can send money into a smart contract, and then I can have certainty about what happens from it. But most transactions in the world aren't actually for money, they're for things, right? So the example I always give is, if I were to pay for a car with Bitcoin, I would send somebody the Bitcoin, and then they wouldn't have sent me ownership of the car, so they would take my Bitcoin and drive away, right? So that's not really a fully trustless transaction. What you need to do is you need to actually tokenize or digitize the asset which is being traded in a market in order to properly apply a blockchain. It's a lot simpler than a lot of the other use cases you've heard about. I think that's a good thing. So let's talk about one of the oldest assets in the world, which is gold, right? So this is actually James, one of the guys who helped us sort of guide our early blockchain strategy. His older sister runs the LBMA in London. The LBMA are the people who decide on the size, shape, weight, and purity of a bar of gold. And what they said is, we're actually in charge of like the standardization of this asset. We're pretty uniquely positioned to put it on a blockchain. Now, the problem is that you can't actually put a physical asset on a blockchain, right? You can't drive a car into a database. You can't stick a bar of gold into a database. But what you can do is you can actually take the ownership of something and assign it to a token and put it on a blockchain, right? And so that's what they did at the LBMA. They said, we're going to take a bar of gold, we're going to put a serial number on it, we're going to put an RFID tag on it, and then we're going to stick it in the vault, and then we're going to represent the ownership of that bar of gold on a blockchain with a token, right? And so from that point forward, the trading of that bar of gold becomes just as efficient as the trading of any cryptocurrency. And so I think that's the proper application of a blockchain to any marketplace, right? You can tokenize the asset, which is actually being traded in the marketplace, remove the middleman, and replace them with software. So the problem is that in order to do that, you need to have that standardization, right? In digital, you couldn't tokenize a gold nugget. In fact, if I was describing to you the gold nugget that was behind the token that I wanted to sell you, this is what I would describe. This is the largest gold nugget that was ever mined. It was in southwestern Australia. It's worth millions of dollars. And then you would take that token and you'd redeem it, and this is what you get, a bunch of fake gold, right? So, we're not at that, right? So the idea though is in order to properly use blockchain, you have to standardize, right? So you need something much more akin to this. Now, in digital media, like I just said, we don't have that standardization. One of the reasons that we spent the past 10 years developing and inventing RTB is because of the lack of standardization of the metric that we use, right? The joke I always make is, if every barrel of oil had a different amount of oil in it, you would fly to Saudi Arabia, knock on every barrel of oil, and assign a different price to it. That sounds a heck of a lot like RTB, doesn't it? Most mature adult markets create a metric which has a consistent amount of value in it, and then they use that as their standard of trading, right? And in digital advertising, we're stuck in this place where we have to actually look at every single unit of something in order to determine our willingness to pay. Like, that's why we're stuck in this place where it's somehow it's considered okay that there's a 30% take rate by the market. You try to do that in a commodities market or a securities market, and they put you in jail. So this is the problem, right? Every single one of these impressions is different. This one below a YouTube video is here for 20 minutes, right? This is all advertising. advertising, and this is like pretty decent, right? There's a couple 300 by 250s. Now, the problem here though is no one knows how much attention is paid to the advertising. What that means is we are able to count how much attention is paid to advertising, and that's what we tokenize, right? So when you put people in control of how long they spend with something, every single second of attention is pretty uniform, right? That's like the bar of gold. And so at Parsec, what we're doing is we're tokenizing attention into a per second basis. So I apologize about this next slide. It's a little bit broken, but what basically happens, and this is a product that we've had live since June of this year. It's a very, very simple implementation. You're going to have to imagine a couple of different agencies here. So what happens when we run a campaign is we get an IO. That causes us to issue tokens to the agency. When the campaign gets started, the agency sends those tokens to a smart contract, and they sit there as the campaign runs. When we start delivering against that smart contract, an external oracle, who in our case is Moat, verifies delivery, causing the smart contract to burn away those credits or those tokens. And that's it. It's really, really simple. We give the agency sort of a view into what happens. But it's a very, very simple implementation of blockchain. And the reason why we were able to do this is because we've created a metric which is tokenizable. The first one is transparency, right? Like, you hear this all the time, and we heard it a bunch today. You need a blockchain for transparency. The thing is that the only time you really need to believe the information that is written to a blockchain is if it impacts the amount of value which is represented in that blockchain. If all we're doing is storing a list of things that people had an opinion of or people misstated themselves, you might as well have them send you a text message or send you an email. There's a great article by the CEO of AdFin on AdExchanger a few months ago where he said, just send me your log files and I'll analyze them. The last thing we need to do is have all of this self-reported data going to the slowest database that's known to man, which is a blockchain. So the second big problem that we have that you hear a lot about is blockchains are too slow, right? Now, everybody in here is in ad tech, right? And or most of the people in ad tech, and we know how long it takes to get paid for advertising, right? It takes maybe 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks. That's the speed at which a blockchain needs to operate, right? And the reason why is because blockchains are for settlement, they're not for matching. Matching is what happens fast, right? And even if you look at the biggest sort of crypto exchanges, they all do off-chain matching and on-chain settlement. And what that means is you have a buyer, you have a marketplace, you have an auction, you have whatever it is, however you're matching the buyer and the seller. Once you find two people that want to transact, then they go on-chain and they do an atomic swap of that asset for that value. So blockchains don't need to be fast. You don't need hundreds of thousands of transactions. You don't need, we did this, we've been doing this for about 5 or 6 months now for 2 Fortune 50 advertisers. And I think we do it like every 6, 12 hours, minutes? Every hour. So it doesn't, so there's this misconception comes from just like a basic misunderstanding of the way markets work. You have matching, where a buyer and seller find each other, and then once they found each other, then they go on-chain for settlement. And that settlement doesn't need to happen fast. And the reason why is because the only reason you need to sort of update a blockchain is to prevent double spend. Right? You guys have all heard that term, right? So one of the big risks in blockchain, if you don't wait until enough blocks are created, before you actually give somebody the thing that they're paying you a Bitcoin for, is they could double spend that. Now in advertising, most of the transactions are pretty small, so the risk or the risk to the publisher is de minimis when we're talking about double spend. All right, so here's the last thing. This is something I'm pretty passionate about. We were about halfway down the line of doing an ICO. Before I realized that basically there is very, very little reason for anybody to have their own proprietary currency except to enrich themselves, right? I talked to dozens of people that are doing ICOs, and I ask them all the time, so what can your token do that Ethereum can't do? And they talk a lot about incentive alignment, and you know what, guess what? Ponzi schemes are also incentive alignment. You're always looking for the guy to take your bag. And I think it's absolutely crazy that we have people out there building all these different blockchains or trying to rationalize the need for a proprietary currency for their dApp. Like, here's the problem, right? Like, you get this in this weird state where people are looking for velocity sinks, right? Does everybody know what a velocity sink is? No. So there's this theory called the velocity of money, which means if nobody has a reason to hold something and they trade in and out of it very quickly, that unit of account very quickly goes to zero, right? So you have projects like, I guess they're not here, so I can call them out. You have projects like MetaX, where they say, like, okay, you're going to hold this token in order to vote on who gets to be on a list of fraud-free websites. Crazy that everybody knows what websites are fraud and what don't. But you end up basically trying to create these really weird incentives for you to hold your token so that the velocity of money doesn't take over and it crashes. The last reason why people shouldn't be developing their own blockchains is there's very little chance that they're going to have fewer bugs than Bitcoin, right? And everybody knows about the big Bitcoin bug that came out that allowed the recipient to actually to increase the amount of money that they were receiving from a transaction. There is very, very, very slim probability that anybody who's building their own blockchain is going to avoid this problem, and it's probably going to be a lot worse for them. So my advice is to stay away from any company that's done an ICO. A lot of people ask me why I'm so angry when I do these, when I'm doing little jet lag here. So the reason why is because we're screwing it up, and we're screwing up the opportunity for the real application of blockchain and digital media, which is the tokenization of assets, the creation of securities, and the eventual financialization of our industry, right? The reason why our industry is so freaking backwards and slow and inefficient is because that we haven't created securities that we're trading, right? What we have to do is to create a standard unit of measurement, a standard metric, enable that to be traded, and then you can start to create bonds, right? So what I'm envisioning is that a publisher, once we create a standard unit of measurement, which by the way doesn't require a blockchain at all, most of the things I'm talking about are really only made better by blockchain. Once we create a standard unit of measurement, we can allow a publisher to issue a bond for a future right to attention. That bond can be retraded, which creates a spot price, and that allows the creation of derivatives. Right? That's when you get a really efficient market. When you I was talking to an economist the other day, and I said, so how do you actually think about, or how do you judge when a market is efficient? And the answer was pretty quick. He's like, well, when there's a functioning futures market. Because without a functioning futures market, buyers and sellers can't de-risk, right? And then you end up having all this like really weird shit happening. If you think about how advertising is bought today, right? If I'm an advertiser and I go to buy ads on a website, there's two really big inefficiencies that happen. One is I can cancel that order, right? If you're buying media and you can cancel that order, the risk that's borne by the publisher is actually priced into all media, right? Mm-hmm. So the second thing is, if I'm going to pay that publisher in 3 months or 6 months or who knows when I'm going to pay for them, I'm actually financing that alone through the publisher. There is zero chance that Hearst is going to give you as good of an interest rate as a real financial liquid market, right? So I think it's really, really important for our industry's growth and for the sort of everything to get better in digital advertising, for us to create a security which can then be tokenized and then sort of create a derivatives market on top of that to bring liquidity to the market.